Good evening, and thank you to Wendy and Tim and to Becca, my co-panelists. I'm going to talk today about the informed consent and abortion, and in particular the mental health debates. And a lot of this picks up on things that Becca mentioned and that Wendy mentioned. And I'm going to try to focus more specifically on the mental health aspects of the informed consent question. It's a really important topic. As Becca said, there's a whole range of regulations that are being enacted at the state level. And these informed consent requirements in particular are really having an impact on how the clinic environment looks for women when they're accessing abortion. And what is it? And you know, it really raises questions about what it means to be accessing care in an environment in which women are receiving information specifically designed to scare them or dissuade them from receiving an abortion. And often, as Becca mentioned, basically false information about the mental health impacts of abortion. I'm going to try to skip through anything that was repetitive, and if I do that and I skip too much, please ask in the Q&A and we'll come back to it. But just by way of an outline, I'm going to talk a little bit about informed consent and informed consent requirements that have been enacted. A little bit of the history of the constitutional litigation, as was mentioned by Wendy and Becca, but I'm going to skip the sort of ideas that they mentioned already and try to pick up the thread of what was happening in terms of mental health debates, and then look specifically at the case of Texas, which is an unfortunate example of how things are moving. So what is informed consent? This is a question that many people have thought about and written about. Wendy Parmet, our host, is one of these people who's written a lot on the subject and is an expert on the topic. But just to give you a very general, brief overview, this is from the American Medical Association guidelines. Informed consent refers to the idea that a physician has the obligation to present medical facts accurately, to make recommendations for management in accordance with good medical practice, that a physician has an ethical obligation to help patients make good choices from amongst therapeutic alternatives consistent with good medical practice. And most interestingly, I think in the context of the abortion debates, is that physicians are given some leeway with regards to the quantity and specificity of the information in terms of tailoring it to meet specific preferences and needs of individual patients. And how should we, and the question becomes, how do we reconcile these types of guidelines with what we have today, which is basically false and misleading information, purposefully designed to force, and the way the laws are written are designed to force physicians to say this information to women, and really information that's designed to prevent women from desiring an abortion any longer. So I'll go through this quickly, but just to give you a sense of the informed consent requirements in the U.S., and again, this comes from the Guttmacher Institute, but 35 states require women to receive counseling before an abortion is performed. 27 states detail the information a woman must be given. 26 states require a woman to wait, as Becca mentioned. The bits that I want to focus on this slide is that 27 states include information on fetal development throughout pregnancy. 12 states include information about the ability of the fetus to feel pain. 5 states require that women be told that personhood begins at conception. So this is a requirement that the physician discloses information or the provider discloses information to the woman. 24 states include information about the risks of abortion, and this is where the mental health debates really sit. But generally speaking, it's kind of a scary landscape. So 21 states include accurate information about the potential effect on abortion, but in 6 states, the written materials are actually inaccurate. 5 of the 7 states include information on breast cancer, and Becca mentioned this as well. It essentially said, physicians are required to say that there's a link between abortion and increased risk of breast cancer. And in 8 of the 22 states that include information, the states mention the possible psychological responses to abortion and only mention negative emotional responses. Now, I have this example here. This isn't on mental health, but I did want to put this out there as well. It does resonate also with what Becca mentioned, which is that much of this information that you're getting on mental health and abortion is also happening in an environment that's explicitly designed to make the experience uncomfortable for the women who are accessing abortion, and also to give an enormous amount of detail about the fetus, an enormous amount of information that's specifically designed to dissuade the woman from wanting an abortion. So, imagine getting all the information, this false information that I just mentioned, in a context where, and this is from the North Carolina law, from the North Carolina statute, where the physician is also forced to display, and it is a physician in particular here, display the ultrasound image so that the pregnant woman has to view them, or provide a medical description of the ultrasound image, which has to include the dimension of the embryo or fetus. And when I display the ultrasound images so the pregnant woman must view them, I just imagine a sort of horrible situation in which a physician is sort of running around the room while the woman is turning her head, and he's she's trying to show this image that the woman doesn't want to see. And actually, if you read some of the news stories and some of the interviews of women that have been done of women who've sought abortions in these contexts, that's often how they feel. They really feel quite traumatized by being forced to see the images they don't want to see. And in the case of traumatic, abortions in more difficult contexts, where women perhaps it's a late-term abortion, or they didn't want to seek the abortions for a medical reason. This is already a very difficult decision. So lots of rationales are offered. These are just three for why women should be forced to sort of have these regulations. One that's often said is that women don't understand the decision they're about to make and need time to think about it. The state has the right to protect fetal life. That's of course in our law. And also, just blatantly that the consequences of abortion, or alleged consequences, will deter women from seeking abortion. So that's really some of the background rationale. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the legal and public health background on mental health and abortion. How did we get to this place where we have all these state laws? And Wendy and Becca both spoke about Casey and the legacy of Casey that we're unfortunately living with. But I want to just pick up on the mental health story here, because I think it's an interesting one. So as it was said, we had Roe versus Wade. It liberalized abortion laws in the United States. But what was interesting in Roe with regards to mental health and abortion is that there was an amicus brief that did say that there was negative mental health consequences for abortion, but in fact the court ignored that entirely and said instead that it's pregnancy or the future maternity, additional offspring, this is what's distressful to women, not the abortion itself, but it's actually having a pregnancy that you don't want to have. Now, between Roe and Casey, and Casey, as we've now heard, is how we get much of these, how we get many of these laws justified today at the state level. We have a huge political shift. So we have the Reagan administration, and in 1987, and this is a big moment that people refer back to, in 1987 there was a directive from Ronald Reagan to the Surgeon General at the time, Everett Koop, and he asked him for a comprehensive report on the psychological and mental health as it relates to abortion. And basically Everett Koop responded, despite the fact that Everett Koop was a pro-life Surgeon General, that there is not enough evidence to suggest a connection between negative and mental health outcomes on abortion. So this is a really heightened political moment in the context of the mental health and abortion debates. The American Psychological Association has also started to, at this point, do research and file amicus briefs on their reaction to the mental health and abortion debates, asserting time and time again that, in fact, there's no consequence, there's no mental health consequences to abortion. And they started doing this in 1983. Obviously, they had signals that this was going to be a big thing, both with the Koop and Reagan conversation, but also with regard to the fact that a brief had already been filed asserting this claim in Roe. So we've talked a little bit about Casey. I'm just going to give a little bit more detail here because it is relevant to the mental health conversation. But at issue in Casey were 5 provisions of the Pennsylvania Abortion Control Act of 1982. So the 5 provisions were that women must give informed consent prior to the abortion procedure, that women must be provided with certain information 24 hours before the abortion is performed. For minor, parental permission must be obtained, and there was a judicial bypass provision. That a married woman must tell her husband of the intended abortion. And then there was a reporting requirement for clinics. And all of these were found constitutional except for the requirement with regards to disclosure to one's husband. I'm going to skip this slide because we've covered it already. But the slide that's the piece of this that's interesting to me is that in the American Psychological Association brief for Casey, they explicitly say many of the things that we're still saying today. So they say first that the state-mandated information is actually exaggerated and misleading. They say that contrary to the impression conveyed by the Commonwealth's brochure, empirical research does not support the contention that abortion is a significant risk factor for detrimental psychological effects. And they talk about how misrepresenting the psychological consequences of abortion are problematic, because that in and of itself could shape how women are experiencing their abortion. So if you tell somebody, for example, that you're going to be traumatized, they might actually be traumatized versus not having had that false information presented to them. So Casey, as we know, as we've heard, shifted the conversation about abortion and informed consent, and it validated the ongoing informed consent requirement. And it's really led to the proliferation of all these laws. So we have Carhart in 2007, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Carhart. So Carhart is the most recent abortion case before the Supreme Court. And it concerns the constitutionality of the Partial Birth Abortion Act of 2003. I'll just give you some information on it because it's interesting, but I'm going to, again, pick up on the mental health piece of this. At issue was a procedure called the intact dilation and extraction, which was posed against the non-intact dilation and extraction. So the intact dilation and extraction is a procedure in which the fetus is largely removed intact versus a procedure in which the fetus is disarticulated prior to removal. And there was no health exception for the intact dilation and extraction procedure, even though it was banned. And the court essentially ruled that it was constitutional despite the fact that there was no health exception for the woman, because this other procedure was still available, which was the non-intact dilation and extraction procedure. And it was a really controversial conversation in the two cases, Stenberg and Carhart. The medical experts, even though they are not really divided, were presented as equally divided on the issue. But most interestingly for the mental health conversation is that Kennedy says in Carhart, while we find no reliable data to measure the phenomenon. Now, I think for anyone interested in public health law, this is a very interesting statement. It seems unexceptionable to conclude that some women come to regret their choice to abort the infant life they once created and sustained. Severe depression and loss of self-esteem can follow. So this became a very famous quote coming out of Carhart, because it really solidified a fact that had been debated for a long time. And by having it in Carhart, in some ways it made it more real. It made it possible for state courts to cite to Carhart as though this was a fact, a true fact that had been established by the court. And we'll see this really clearly in the Texas case. Now, this is really a betrayal, I think, also of Kennedy's position here, where he's essentially citing to highly politically motivated anecdotes that were put before the court. They were collected in part by the Justice Foundation, an organization which continues to collect testimonies of women and their experiences with abortion. In fact, you can go to the website and put your information in the website about your experience. It was also rallied by an organization called Operation Outcry, which is the ministry of the Justice Foundation, and their specific goal is to end the pain of abortion by exposing the truth about its devastating impact on women, men, and families. And many of the briefs, and they cite to many of the briefs that they've written and many of the briefs that cite to their work, also cite to a lot of the evidence on mental health and abortion, which I'll talk about in a minute, which has been extensively problematized. Oh, this is my next slide. So, with regard to current evidence, there's many studies that have been done, and I just picked up on these three, and I partly picked up on these three because I'm also doing a different bit of research on how the UK guidelines came to be, and I'll show you a slide with the UK guidelines. The UK guidelines reflect largely on these three studies. So one is the Charles Review is what it's called. It's a meta-analysis. It's a ranking of studies based on quality of methodological factors, and what they find is that if you rank the studies based on the methodologies they use, the higher ranked studies show no association between mental health outcomes and abortion, whereas lower ranked studies do find an association. So meaning the studies that are poor quality studies essentially find an association. The American Psychological Association did a review in 2008, and their review also concluded that you cannot make a definitive statement about whether abortion causes mental health problems. There are simply no methodologically rigorous studies enough to do so. Now, I put this up here with some trepidation because, but it is a study that gets cited to frequently, largely by pro-life advocates. But Priscilla Coleman is also someone who produces quite a lot of data, and her data shows that abortion is associated with poor mental health outcomes. Her studies have been largely discredited by the mainstream public health audience, by providers, and we can talk a little bit more about why, and how these evidentiary debates play out. And there's quite in the British Journal of Psychiatry, after this paper was published, there were actually multiple responses and letters written to the British Journal of Psychiatry discrediting Coleman's study and study methodology. And the reason I put this up here is really to say that what Kennedy did when he made the statement that we read here today, that we find no reliable data to measure the phenomenon, is discredit all of the actual public health data that exists on mental health and abortion that explicitly suggests that there is no connection, and in a sense really validated and gave a voice to the people who are suggesting that there is a connection between negative mental health consequences and abortion. So let's talk a little bit about how this is playing out in one state context, and this is how I'll conclude. In 2011, and this is part of the proliferation of laws that Becca mentioned that happened in 2011, Texas passed House Bill 15. It's known as the Women's Right to Know Act, which certainly sounds really nice. And it says the physician who is about to perform an abortion must perform and display a sonogram of the fetus, make audible the heartbeat of the fetus for the woman to hear, explain the results of the procedure, and wait 24 hours in most cases between these disclosures and performing the abortion. So a pregnant woman can choose not to receive the verbal explanation of the results of the sonogram if the pregnancy is a result of rape or incest, if the individual is a minor utilizing judicial bypass procedures to avoid parental notification, or has a fetus with an irreversible medical condition or abnormality. So there is a little bit of there are some exceptions here. So what the booklet, when you go to the clinic, when you go to a Texas clinic, you will receive a booklet, and it's called the Women's Right to Know booklet. And in the booklet, it says this about mental health, the mental health consequences of abortion. It says, you should know that some women experience different emotions after an abortion. Some women may feel guilty, sad, or empty, while others may feel relief that the procedure is over. Some women have reported serious psychological effects after their abortion, including depression, grief, anxiety, lowered self-esteem, regret, suicidal thoughts and behavior, sexual dysfunction, and avoidance of emotional attachment, flashbacks, and substance abuse. So you can see how this basically is spinning out of control a little bit. And when Texas medical providers sued to have an injunction against this law, essentially the case went up to the Fifth Circuit. The lower courts did grant an injunction, but the case went up to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit said, and they copied that quote out of Hart completely into the decision at the Fifth Circuit, and said, this is clearly true. The import of these cases is clear. First, informed consent laws that do not impose an undue burden on the woman's right to have an abortion are permissible if they require truthful, non-misleading, and relevant disclosures. And what made this partly a truthful disclosure, even though it's patently full of sort of false and exaggerated information, was the citation back to Carhart. So, that we can really see the ripple effect of the Carhart decision. And in fact, we could say that we see how, a fact that started with conservative assertions post-Roe, it traveled into the Reagan-Koop debates in the 80s, it's legitimated by the Casey court, it's validated by conservative activism like Operation Outcry, now it's gone to the Supreme Court in Carhart, and now we can see this sort of ripple effect of it all through the state laws, and it's treated as fact. And in fact, in the Texas decision, it's really interesting because the court goes so far as to say, well, these people who are asserting the conservatives, or essentially the people who want the heightened informed consent requirements, are the ones who want the actual information to be given to the women. Everybody else is ideological, and they cite to the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of ideological. So it's the progressives who are being ideological, and the conservatives at this time who are being sort of fact-based. So I thought I just end by sort of putting the Texas guidelines next to the UK guidelines. And what's important to know is that the UK guidelines were also done after considering the studies that I put up on the slide earlier, so the Charles study, the Coleman review, etc. This was all taken into consideration. And versus in Texas, when you go to the clinic and you're told that you might have depression, grief, anxiety, sexual dysfunction, flashbacks, substance abuse. In the UK, the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists suggests that women with an unintended pregnancy should be informed that the evidence suggests that they are no more likely to suffer adverse psychological sequela, whether they have an abortion or continue with a baby. So you can see here how we've kind of split dramatically from another country that has a very similar, a very similar context, the United States, with regards to abortion. So I'll stop there.